Let's go ahead and get started.
All right.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Davenant Hall Fellows Lecture. My name is Michael Riggins. I'm the acquisitions editor of the Davenant Press. Um, if you're watching this lecture, you probably already know something about the Davenant Institute, but if you just happen to stumble onto this through social media, or maybe you're watching this later over YouTube, the Davenant Institute is committed to retrieving the wisdom of classical Protestantism for the contemporary church. We do that in a variety of ways. We publish books. We host a journal where we hope to start dialogue about important things in the Christian tradition. We host conferences all around the country, especially at our study center in Landrum, South Carolina. And most importantly, for tonight's purposes, we also have what we call Davenant Hall, which is our online theological education program. And it's really our attempt at reimagining the medieval university for today's digital culture. So we have these monthly fellows lectures, which is really just an opportunity for the public to hear some of the world-class faculty that we've got teaching at Davenant Hall. Our speaker tonight's name is Joseph Minich. He is a residential teaching fellow at the Davenant Institute in Landrum, South Carolina. He's the author of two books, Enduring Divine Absence through the Davenant Press and Bulwarks of Unbelief out this year from Lexham Press, and the editor of several works with the Davenant Press, as well as the founding editor of Ad Fontes. He is also the host of the Pilgrim Faith podcast. His lecture tonight is titled C.S. Lewis as Historian of Religion. So that being said, Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michael. It's really good to be here with this virtual audience. For those of you who don't know the background here, as Michael just alluded, I'm coming from Landrum, South Carolina. The facility you see behind me where I live is in fact our Davenant House, our residential facility at which a lot of really wonderful work for the kingdom of God goes on. It's a really fun thing to be a part of, and I'm grateful to be here this evening to talk to all of you. For first-time readers of C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, one of the most peculiar elements in the whole tale is the role that the ancient magician Merlin plays in the story. On the one hand, we have a book about 20th century corporate and techno-totalitarianism, a book that stands alongside 1984 and Brave New World as a reading of the overall direction of late modern society. We could likewise compare that hideous strength to other Christian attempts at imagining the apocalypse, a more theologically accented apocalypse or its portent. And here you might think of Left Behind or even This Present Darkness. On the other hand, what could any of that possibly have to do with the Merlin of Arthurian legend? In the narrative, we find that Merlin is said to represent an older magic that is different from the techno-magic of the National Institute of Certified Experiments, or the NICE. It is for this reason that the NICE wishes to resuscitate Merlin's body from Bragdon Wood before the occupants of St. Anne's, led by Ransom, are able to do so. NICE director Wither's thoughts are described like this, quote, "The old druid," that is Merlin, would inevitably cast his lot with the new planners. What could prevent his doing so? A junction would be effected between two kinds of power which between them would determine the fate of our planet. Doubtless that had been the will of the Dark Eldils for centuries, end quote. Similarly, on the other side of the battle in this narrative, Ransom himself notes that, quote, "when the new power from Belbury," that is the NICE that we just mentioned, "joins up with the old power under Bragdon Wood," or Merlin, "man will be almost surrounded," end quote. In part, then, the significance of Merlin is that he represents an older magic and mode of power that, or so the techno-corporatists hope, can be combined with their modern sort of power in order to gain a more profound kind of control, even a control over their own bodies. He is the final key to their Babel, you might say. From the point of view which is accepted in hell, Lewis narrates, quote, "the whole history of our earth had led up to this moment. There was now at last a real chance for fallen man to shake off that limitation of his power which mercy had imposed upon him as a protection from the full results of the fall. If this succeeded, hell would be at last incarnate," end quote. But what accounts for this? Why would it require resuscitating Merlin to get back to this older kind of magic? In part, this lecture is an attempt to answer this. As the narrative develops, of course, one is surprised to discover that neither the nice nor the denizens of St. Anne's find Merlin, but rather that Merlin is awoken of himself in a sense and finds the occupants of he himself finds the occupants of St. Anne's, always destined toward them, contra director Wither's impressions from the get-go. As Ransom notes, quote, "We have all been mistaken. So is the enemy. They thought that if he came back, he would be on theirs, the other side. I find he is on ours," end quote. Of course, things immediately get complicated in the narrative when ancient Merlin joins the modern people of St. Anne's. Most memorably, he somewhat nonchalantly notes that Jane's barrenness, or what he believes is her barrenness, is self-willed, and that, quote, "it would be a great charity if you gave order that her head should be cut from her shoulders," end quote. Adjusting to the new member of their squad, then, the Fellowship of St. Anne's is quite taken aback by their new member. Dr. Dimble reflects the following day, quote, "We've all been imagining that because he came back to the 20th century, he'd be a 20th century man. Time is more important than we thought," end quote. It's this theme that I wish to take up this evening in the writings of Lewis. Time is more important than we thought. Lewis' interest in time is present throughout his novels and his didactic corpus, writing about the power that the past exercises over the present in the abolition of man, for instance. Lewis writes, quote, "The latter point is not always sufficiently emphasized because those who write on social matters have not yet learned to imitate the physicists by including time among the dimensions. In order to understand fully what man's power over nature, and therefore the power of some men over other men, really means, we must picture the race extended in time from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction. Each generation exercises power over its successors, and each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors," end quote. One detects a similar line of reasoning in Lewis' greatest work, Miracles, greatest in my judgment. Lewis can write that, quote, a nation's moral outlook is just so much of its share in eternal moral wisdom. A nation's moral outlook is just its share in eternal moral wisdom, just so much its share in eternal moral wisdom, as its history, economics, etc., lets through," end quote. Time is more important than we thought it was. Time, in the mouth of Dr. Dimble, is crucial for understanding how Merlin can seem brutal to us, but still be, to invoke a primitivism, one of the good guys. Formed against such a radically different backdrop, Merlin does not simply possess a different will from our own, but as we shall have occasion to explore below, a different kind of mind, or a different mind than we do as well. Not a different kind of faculty, mind you, but rather that same faculty engaged in radically different temporal and discursive contexts with radically different results in human experience. So the thesis for tonight then. Tonight I'm going to argue that these kinds of cross-temporal thought experiments are actually baked into the entire corpus of Lewis novels and didactic works. That is to say, Lewis is quite interested in what accounts for both the continuity and discontinuity between humans across time, and especially how this applies to the understanding of the cosmos and of God. I'm going to argue that you can, from Lewis fiction, somewhat reconstruct a kind of speculative history of religion, albeit in an orthodox imaginative key. Lewis is fascinated with precisely how humans experience the world at various stages of understanding, and precisely why they thought the thoughts about it that they did. Moreover, Lewis' novels contain an implicit history of theology in man's talk about God. What does this amount to? I'm arguing that in Lewis fiction, we get a theoretical reconstruction, or we can find a theoretical reconstruction of precisely how God has been understood and talked about through time, and how one understanding shifted organically into another. You might say that Lewis is trying to imagine the steps in discourse and understanding between, say, a theology of Adam, how that would develop into a theology of Moses, and Moses into a theology of Paul, and the latter into a not inspired, of course, theology of Augustine, or some other representative, and finally into the theological speak that we have today. again, uninspired. To clarify on the front side, even if we say that the objects of understanding, like understanding God or understanding the cosmos, are shared to a large degree across a slice of time, it stands to fact that Abraham's precise understanding of things, in the classic sense of that term understanding, is not the same as, say, Irenaeus' precise understanding of things. It is the same cosmos and the same God that is understood, but from different vantage points relative to different questions. Lewis is imaginatively reconstructing the set of steps that have developed how we imagine God from the beginning until now. It's crucial to note that telling a single story of development and human understanding is necessarily to take the deepest human oral traditions, ancient Near Eastern culture, Second Temple Judaism, late antiquity, the medieval mind, and ourselves very seriously. Indeed, all are dialogue partners. Those coming before ourselves on the list are not primitives whom we sophisticate, but fathers who are tapped into some things, or who were tapped into some things that we are not, even as we might likewise point out things they never imagined to say. Of course, we can say them because we're standing on their shoulders. In this sense, one might say that Lewis is attempting a kind of cross-temporal ecumenicity, rather than a simple ecumenicity across contemporary opinion. Lewis wants to find a unity across the diversity of time. Before moving on to make this case with torturous brevity, it's worth highlighting what is at stake in Lewis' formulae. Or said differently, let us highlight what kinds of conversations his formulae make possible. In my judgment, there are three reasons that especially evangelicals should be interested in Lewis's proposals. First, I think Lewis gives us the categories we need to fully read Genesis 1 to 11 well. I'm not going to belabor this point tonight, but C. John Collins' Reading Genesis Well extensively draws upon Lewis to orient our hermeneutic. A tortuously short way to put it might be that Genesis 1 to 11 does tell us a history, but a history written the way that a very different people would have written it. Second, I think that Lewis gives us the categories by which we might resolve some of our recent tensions between biblical and systematic theologians, between those who are concerned about the allegedly unfortunate traffic between biblical and philosophical language. In fact, I think Lewis renders less mysterious just how the latter added to, but never replaces, the former. Third, Lewis is likewise interested in us, and he has some thoughts about how our own moment in history might fit within the whole. It is only the second point, however, on the theologians that I'll attempt to cash out at the end of this particular lecture, that my previous fellow's lecture, Lewis as a Sage of Modernity, somewhat gets at that last point for those who are interested in that. For the rest of this lecture, then, I'll proceed in three steps. First, I'll summarize Lewis' implicit doctrine of human development, noting the background relation to the philosophy of Owen Barfield. Second, I'll point out how Lewis implicitly reconstructs various stages and frontiers of human development in his corpus, and we'll focus on one of them. And finally, I'll conclude with some suggestions about how this might constitute, as the kids say these days, an intervention in the tension between the biblical and the systematic theologians. So first, human development in Owen Barfield. 2, the reconstructed stages of knowing themselves. 3, how does this help the biblical and systematic theologians become friends? So first, human development and Owen Barfield. It takes a lot of effort to really imagine what it might be like not to know anything, or to put it less extremely, to know very little. For a moment, let's say that God created Adam not with some full knowledge, but rather with only the most basic apparatus for growing in knowledge. Prior to the actual exercise of human dominion, there was no knowledge of salt, pepper, basket weaving, what bark is made out of, etc. And indeed, if we really plunge into the depths of this, really think about the amount of things that are like that, we'll have to realize that we would have to realize that the vast majority of discoveries and habits that we take for granted have probably been pioneered by individuals and peoples that have been lost to memory. In Perelandra's Green Lady, a parody of Our Eve, we discover a human, or something like a human, freshly created, who doesn't really know anything except what God directly reveals to her. As Ransom converses with her throughout the novel, she continually states that each new piece of knowledge makes her older. And indeed, some of those advances in knowledge and some of those advances in knowledge alter what life feels like for her. In one particularly poignant moment, the Green Lady says to Ransom, "I have been so young till this moment that all of my life now seems to have been a kind of sleep. I have thought that I was being carried, and behold, I was walking." End quote. In context, Ransom is introducing Tinadrill to a conscious relationship to her own freedom. And it is fascinating to note her precise words. Discourse affects a kind of change of experience, as in the change between being awake and being asleep. Said differently, the way we say things and frame our reality dramatically affects what we notice about reality, and that shapes our experience of it. In this matter, Lewis is profoundly influenced by Owen Barfield and Edwin Bevan, and I can't do justice to the fascinating mind of Owen Barfield in this lecture. Lewis scholars are, of course, aware that he refers to Barfield quite frequently, even in the mouths of his characters in his novels. He's mentioned in That Hideous Strength explicitly, I believe, in the mouth of Ransom. And of course, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is dedicated to Barfield's daughter Lucy, the namesake of our Narnian Lucy. Barfield is best known for his work Saving the Appearances, a study in idolatry, which is a short but complicated book. For our purposes, we can summarize his view as involving the claim that mankind throughout history has experienced very different appearances of the world. For Barfield, unlike Lewis, it can sometimes even seem as though the world outside our heads just is a historical succession of public appearances. It's not clear to me that Lewis quite takes this line, but Lewis does certainly believe that the world has appeared in vastly different ways to different people, and that in some sense all of them grasp something of reality through different modes of attention. For Barfield, these shifts in human experience are likewise shifts in human language. Barfield, like Ransom, was a philologist whose work involved some study of the most primitive origins of language. In studying the effect of poetry, contemporary poetry even, on a reader, Barfield became persuaded that language originally wasn't simply kind of labeling objects, but was bound up with experience and with the world in a way that it is difficult for us to reconstruct. That is what kind of original language was like. It is possible, for instance, that Adam didn't just emerge out of the garden labeling things with the same kinds of orientation that we do. What precisely was involved in that original naming? Part of what Barfield and Bevan discover is that some of the most primitive moments of language aren't full of smaller words that we've made more complicated, but rather of larger ones, denser associations that later language breaks up, distinguishes, and objectifies. What this amounts to for Barfield is that our ancestors really did experience the world in a way that felt very different. Felt very, very different from the way we do, not just at the level of their own subjectivity, but because they were attended to different dimensions of reality than we are. It's actually quite astonishing how many moments in the Ransom Trilogy are concerned with language. Lewis, of course, has this narrative invention of old solar language, and that especially exemplifies this. At one point when Dr. Dimble is practicing his old solar for a coming encounter with Merlin, Lewis writes, quote, "The voice did not sound like Dimble's own. It was as if the words spoke themselves through him from some strong place at a distance, or as if they were not words at all, but present operations of God, the planets, and the Pendragon. For this was the language spoken before the fall and beyond the moon, and the meanings were not given to the syllables by chance or skill or long tradition, but truly inherent in them, as the shape of the great sun is inherent in the little water drop. This was language herself, as she first sprang at Melville's bidding out of the molten quicksilver of the star called Mercury on Earth, but Vera Trilbia in deep heaven," end quote. But of course, Dr. Dimble mostly remains a modern person in his consciousness. For Merlin, it is quite different. As Dr. Dimble continues his above-mentioned discourse on time with his very patient listening wife, he notes that Merlin is, quote, the last vestige of an old order in which matter and spirit were, from our modern point of view, confused. For him, every operation on nature is a kind of personal contact, like coaxing a child or stroking one's horse, end quote. He likewise describes the world from which Merlin comes as one in which, quote, mental processes were much more like physical actions, end quote. As Lewis narrates this moment where the team at St. Anne's is searching for Merlin, he says, quote, it was an age, not a man, that awaited them, end quote. This kind of language is very resonant with Barfield's own kind of history of consciousness, which involves some accounting for so-called primitive language and the formulation of so-called myth. Most difficult for us to imagine is a world in which mankind did not feel so separated from the world around them. Charles Taylor can even speak of the medieval porous self relative to the buffered selves we have today in his taxonomy. In making this distinction, the basic idea is that my internal states, and the old porous self of the medieval times, my internal states are felt to be sort of continuous with the events and things in the world outside of me, all pouring into me, affecting me, with me kind of right up in them. The tree's not over there, but its particles are inside of me, and I feel that internally, as it were. Through a long shift in practical and mental habit, it is more natural for modern persons to attend to themselves as subjects over against so many objects in the world. Strikingly, for both Lewis and Barfield, Taylor's medieval buffered selves are already far more differentiated from things than our primitive ancestors. In fact, in the very first chapter of The Discarded Image, Lewis writes, quote, medieval man shared many ignorances with the savage, and some of his beliefs may suggest savage parallels to an anthropologist. But he had not usually reached these beliefs by the same route as the savage, end quote. He goes on to say, though, quote, if you go back through many generations of those ancestors, then at last you may find, or at least conjecture, an age when that mythology was coming into existence in what we suppose to be a savage fashion. But the English poet, the medieval English poet, knew nothing about that. It is further from him than he is from us, end quote. And so we have a handful of vectors before us. Man starts in non-sinful ignorance and grows radically in knowledge. 2, this is not just a matter of knowing objects better, but rather involves stages of human contact with things in which thought and experience were unified in some way with their objects. That's hard for us to kind of recapture. 3, this growth can be discerned somewhat in the development of human language and is parallel to it, kind of archaeologically preserved in it for the philologist, you might say. Ancient language names the world at a moment radically different from our own, and shifts in this naming both catalyze and reflect shifts in human experience. 4, part of this development does involve a kind of self-differentiation and distance from one's own experience and from objects in the world, even as we remain inside our experiences and the world. And then 5, while such differentiation is not a moral failure, it can, combined with our failure to remember and attend, become a loss of humanity. Just as an elder man loses something of his humanity when he no longer remembers the irreducible and always crucial vantage point of the child, so we can become metaphysically grumpy old men who are trapped inside our own framings and totally forgetful of the life that got us here. Worse, we can become unattached to the world. So that's point 1, Lewis, Owen Barfield, human development. Second, then, what are the basic plot points of Lewis' history of development? One has perhaps already noticed in the above quotes that Lewis can at least distinguish ourselves from medieval man and medieval man from primitive man. And once again, it is crucial to note that this is a development both in the human mind and in the human will, or perhaps more precisely, the relation of each of these to the whole order of things, you might say. Notably, Lewis can even speak about the Tao as changing. quote, those who understand the spirit of the Tao, he writes, and who have been led by that spirit, can modify it in directions which the spirit itself demands. He goes on, from within the Tao itself comes the only authority to modify the Tao, end quote. One might say that Lewis' Tao isn't simply natural law, which he might label its innermost axioms, but rather, at least on its margins, something like natural law inflected through always inevitable custom and tradition. It is a way in which one is habituated into natural law, and which is a partial participation in the full expression that is latent within the axioms of theoretical and practical reasoning. But where can we identify these stages more explicitly in Lewis' writings? I think we can note at least three moments of great import to Lewis as he kind of imaginatively reconstructs our history. It seems to me that we can certainly identify Lewis' fascination with the transition from, roughly speaking, mythos to logos. That is to say, the broad transition between a very material description of things to a more philosophical and formal one. Lewis' original interest, of course, was the way in which the medieval models of the universe combine these, both the kind of material and formal orders. And then he is fascinated by our own moment between and he is then fascinated by our own moment toward basic psychological and I'm going to skip that sentence. My focus tonight is going to remain on that first transition between mythos and logos. Possibly we see this first transition in the contrast between the Hross and the Sorns in Out of the Silent Planet. The Hross, a civilization of pre-literate poets, always tell Ransom to consult the Sorns when he asks anything too, by our standards, abstract or scientific for them. Moreover, it is fascinating to observe how their poetry and language afford them a very different experience of time. Most memorably, when Ransom is confused about why the Hross only mate during one brief period of their life, his extraterrestrial tutor is confused about why Ransom can't understand the role that poetic recitation plays in keeping love alive. Memory is not so disconnected, but always present to the present. Arguably, the Hross are an imaginative reconstruction of how a pre-literate rational animal would talk about and experience the world, as well as how they would have related to myth and language. And crucially, a large portion of the narrative is meant to help a modern reader attend differently. In each of the foreign exchanges, their primitive is only shown to be something older, not something less real or less in contact with the real world. When Ransom meets with the Sorns, however, he's introduced to a species of rational animal who is at least pre-philosophical. While the language is not quite that of the philosopher, the mental gestures perhaps represent what you might find in the most philosophical portion of the Second Temple period. Why, for instance, might an ancient Israelite have somehow written about God as having a body of sorts, or attributed bodily things to God in some way, but also imply otherwise in other places? Augre the Sorn perhaps helps us here, answering Ransom's questions about the spectral Eldila, kind of angels in the narrative. It's worth quoting his conversation at length. So starting with Ransom question to Augre the Sorn, quote, "But what are the Eldila? And why can I not see them? Have they no bodies?" Of course they have bodies. There are a great many bodies you cannot see. Every animal's eyes see some things, but not others. Do you know of many kinds of body in Thulkandra? Ransom tried to give the Sorn some idea of the terrestrial terminology of solids, liquids, and gases. It listened with great attention. "That is not the way to say it," it replied. "Body is movement. If it is at one speed, you smell something. If at another, you hear a sound. If at another, you see a sight. If at another, you neither see nor hear nor smell. But nor know the body in any way. But mark this small one, that the two ends meet." "How do you mean?" "If the movement is faster, then that which moves is more nearly in two places at once." That is true. "But if the movement were faster still, it is difficult, for you don't know many words. you see that if you made it faster and faster, in the end, the moving thing would be in all places at once, small one. I think I see that. Well, then, that is the thing at the top of all bodies, so fast that it is at rest, so truly body that it has ceased being body at all. But we will not talk of that. Start from where we are, small one. The swiftest thing that touches our senses is light. We do not truly see light. We only see slower things lit by it, so that for us, light is on the edge. The last thing we know before things become too swift for us. But the body of an Eldil is a movement as swift as light. You may say its body is made of light, but not of that which is light for the Eldil. His light is a swifter movement, which for us is nothing at all. And what we call light is for him a thing like water, not illuminated by the swifter. And what we call firm things, flesh and earth, seem to him thinner and harder to see than our light, and more like clouds and nearly nothing. To us, an Eldil is a thin, half-real body that can go through walls and rocks. To himself, he goes through them because he is solid and firm, and they are like clouds. And what is true light to him and fills the heaven so that he will plunge into the rays of the sun to refresh himself from it, is to us the black nothing in the sky at night. These things are not strange, small one, though they are beyond our senses. End quote. So fast that it is at rest, so truly body that it has ceased being body at all. Indeed, one can imagine an Hebrew from antiquity coming into contact with philosophical thought in the centuries before Christ. And perhaps, while the grammar of the ancients and of the philosophers is largely different, there slowly emerges the capacity to see how they can roughly translate into one another, at least be analogized, not fully, but at least analogized and compared to one another, as twin descriptions in some cases of a common object. What it means to portray God as having a body in an ancient mind is not the same thing as it would be if we said God had a body. Lewis makes this explicit in a certain section of Miracles, writing, quote, "We are often told that primitive man could not conceive of pure spirit, but then neither could he conceive of mere matter. A throne and a local habitation are attributed to God only at that stage when it is still impossible to regard the throne or palace even of an earthly king as merely physical objects. In earthly thrones and palaces, it was the spiritual significance, as we should say, the atmosphere, that mattered to the ancient mind. Until we have faces, there's a lot of comments about the atmosphere of the throne room and of the temple. As soon as the contrast of spiritual and material was before their minds, they knew God to be spiritual and realized that their religion had implied that all along. But at an earlier stage, that contrast was not there. To regard that earlier stage as unspiritual because we find there was no clear assertion of an unembodied spirit is a real misunderstanding. You might just as well call it spiritual because it contained no clear consciousness of mere matter. Mr. Barfield has shown, as regards the history of language, that words did not start by referring merely to physical objects and then get extended by metaphor to refer to emotions, mental states, and the like. On the contrary, what we now call the literal and metaphorical meanings have both been disengaged by analysis from an ancient unity of meaning, which was neither or both, end quote. This key transition between mythos and logos is likewise imagined and highlighted throughout Till We Have Faces. The contrast between the pagan religion of Ungit and the philosophy of the fox, the Stoic Greek philosopher, is a constant refrain throughout the narrative. When Psyche comes back to tell Orwell of that space she entered after death, she says, quote, "There was a lot of the fox's philosophy in it. Things he says about the gods or the divine nature, but mixed up with things the priest said too, about the blood and the earth and how sacrifice makes the crops grow. I'm not explaining it well. It seemed to come from somewhere deep inside of me, deeper than the parts that see pictures of gold and amber palaces, deeper than fears and tears. It was shapeless, but you could just hold on to it, or just let it hold on to you." Then the change came, end quote. When Lewis says, then the change came, that's usually a description of some kind of conversion. Moreover, it is interesting to note that Till We Have Faces seems to be about an imaginary Western European country that exists within the timeline of our own history. The fox is Greek and specifically Stoic. And as the novel progresses, we likewise see an interesting depiction toward the end of changes within the very myths of Orwell's community. One might suggest that Lewis is, at least in part, kind of imagining a kind of providential ordering of a particular country's myths toward a direction that is latent for fulfillment in the gospel that would come to those lands several centuries later. The kind of like this and kind of like that description of the true cosmic and spiritual realities is, it would seem, partly rooted in Lewis' love for the medieval synthesis, a model that fascinated him for his whole life. The medieval mind represents a kind of unity of biblical and philosophical vantage points. Indeed, the whole period of Second Temple Judaism and the development of early Christian theology represent a sort of frontier negotiation between the languages, a negotiation already begun in the pages of the New Testament and surrounding Jewish communities themselves. There are many texts one might highlight to emphasize how that conversation is taken on by the church afterwards, but Johannes Zakuber's recent The End of Ancient Metaphysics and the Rise of Christian Theology demonstrates that the whole trajectory of Western philosophy could not have been what and as it was without the incarnation and the questions and thoughts that it generated in the formal order. So the fact that God took on a body generates all these questions in the formal order that take philosophy in a direction it wouldn't have gone otherwise. Just as the coming of Christ was an event in the history of the human will, as Tom Holland demonstrates so elegantly in his recent Dominion, Christ's coming was likewise an event in the history of the human mind. Not simply forcing the square peg of the Bible into the round hole of received categories, rather, the latter are, while not wholly changed, reimagined at certain frontiers of knowing, and yet precisely in a way that presses the mind more deeply into the very realities which philosophers long to look. This conversion of imagination also becomes its fulfillment. It would take a great deal of argument, of course, to precisely identify the movement from A to B. How does one say it this way to go from saying it this way to saying it that way, and why? Moreover, in what context and for what does the grammar of philosophy develop in the first place? That's a really important question, actually. What is it trying to do? And is it a very different kind of mental exercise than what it is attempted in, say, the psalmic descriptions of God? The kind of final cause of these two discourses matter a lot. And if so, are they contradictory tasks or approaches to reality? And what of the modern situation? No small part of Michael Ward's wonderful Planet Narnia is demonstrating how Lewis brings the medieval world to bear on the modern imagination, mediating between two maps of the world through weaving a spell in narrative. Lewis' peculiar magic involves tilling the soil of the modern self so that a renewed historical and philosophical memory can be planted in modern people, precisely, though, for the carrying on of being ourselves. For as he constantly insists in his corpus, there is no going back. Robert Bellah, in his own history of religion, might be right that nothing is ever lost. Lewis would agree, but I think he would add, nothing is ever repeated. Third, then, and finally, how does any of this help us to reconcile the seemingly eternal struggle between the biblical theologians and the systematic theologians? And ending with a few gestures on this matter, I promise to frustrate everyone as much as possible, and so I'll do so by presenting the possible implications of the above as a set of hypotheses which I won't prove, but which gesture at the kind of synthesis Lewis is able to imagine, perhaps uniting the sages of Jerusalem, Athens, and Logos. So I think I have 10 of these here, very brief. One, of first importance, the reason to even attempt such a thing is precisely because the mind has already determined that each side of the equation immediately grasps something of the real world. That is, we're not just trying to make everyone get along, but rather demonstrate that reality is more dense than reductive modern projections. Lewis really internalized ancient philosophical thought, but also had an unusually intense imagination for trying to understand pre-philosophical antiquity and post-philosophical modernity. 2, you can know a ton about the Old Testament and really fail to imagine what all of its images and words amounted to for an ancient Israelite. One can likewise read a ton about ancient philosophy and fail to imagine what it amounted to for, say, the early Christians. In this sense, many contemporary biblicist commentators on the philosophical tradition excuse me, let me try that again. I'm tripping over my words here. In this sense, many contemporary biblicist commentators on the philosophical tradition are about as inside the head of the fathers as the author of the Golden Bough was inside the head of the ancient Israelites. 3, we have to learn more precisely how to compare the grammars, not where one is the inner fulfillment of the other, or one simply the pre-stage primitivism for scholastic enlightenment. These grammars are irreducibly themselves. What is common between them is that they belong to people sharing a nature, and they illuminate a common world. 4, for this reason, a post-Christian philosophical gaze does not force Moses to be a conscious Neoplatonist, but rather seeks to understand how the old sages understood the world and detect how that is the same world about which later persons, even later Jews, ask different questions with different but complementary kinds of answers. By comparison, one can imagine the different stages of understanding God and the world within an individual human life. The conceptual grammar of children versus that of the adult perhaps seem incommensurable, but in fact they are not. The proof? Each of us has quite literally experienced a single continuous impression of such things that has morphed organically through time. The point is not to say, of course, that our older ancestors were intellectually primitive, but most lived in contexts where many of the sorts of questions we asked were undeveloped and unthought. The point is exclusively that this does not imply total incommensurability as such, even if what it takes to hold them together is our own conversion of imagination. 5, fleshing it out, we should not think of God as accommodating himself to the primitive understandings of our ancestors in a way that we no longer require because we have arrived at a sort of truth that is pure. It is not as though God just made the world and then left us to talk about it and then works within our conjectures and kind of puts himself inside of them. God did make the world, but he also made the mind to be adequated to it and really penetrate into its depths. And he is likewise the author of human language, albeit leaving much to human art in the development of that language. All this to say, the movement from ancient to, say, philosophical thought isn't a matter of using some pre-philosophical stage of human scaffolding to be able to really say the things. No, God made speech as fitted to and always already grasping a hold of the real world. Moreover, and crucially, we never leave the older language or its vantage point. We still need to say that God is our rock, just as we still deploy the verbs and nouns that we learned prior to conscious memory as children. And to the extent that this mode of divine predication is taken as derivative of something better, we have taken a wrong turn somewhere. 6, viewed from this perspective, we do not need to reduce the amount of registers on which, say, the Old Testament speaks to us. If it does not speak to the kinds of philosophical questions we ask directly, that is partially because such questions had not even arisen formally. But this does not mean that there are not, so to speak, philosophical gestures or proto-philosophical mental movements latent in its descriptions. One could give many examples here, but most fascinating to me is the implication of portraying God as kind of outside the blob of everything that undergoes creaturely differentiation. For most accounts in the ancient Near East, and I think there might be an exception or two here, but for most accounts in the ancient Near East, when you read the myths, the gods are kind of separated out from that blob of everything, which everything comes from. Placing God outside of that blob Both makes possible what will develop into a very refined doctrine of creation ex nihilo in the first and second centuries AD, but perhaps as well a discourse about the divine nature that emphasizes divine unity, transcendence, and a kind of life that is outside separating things that separate from other things. 7. The tension between biblical and systematic theologians cannot be resolved without reference to a wider discourse that is often lost in the mix, and that is the larger discourse about the transition from mythos to logos altogether. Stephen R. L. Clark's Ancient Mediterranean Philosophy, a text, is a good proxy for both the conceptual apparatus required as well as the literature within which one might find those who do that kind of comparative work in the way that a Lewis might have done. 8. Crucially, it is often thought that the systematic theologian's project upon, say that again. It's often thought that the systematic theologians project upon the ancient peoples in a way that more domesticated biblical theologians do not. From the perspective of what has been written about above, though, it's unclear that an ancient Israelite would have found a Peter Leithart any less mysterious philosophically than a Thomas Aquinas. And there is reason to suspect that they would have found the latter far more comprehensible on some registers. Most of the times, biblical theologians are engaged in an analytical redescription of the world, ritual theory, sociological theory, all that kind of thing. An analytical redescription of ancient texts that would have seemed just as weird to see put that way to an ancient mind as would any discussion of form, matter, essence, and existence. And that's not to knock a Leithart. No, I quite appreciate Dr. Leithart and much of his work, but the point is just to say that we're not less far away from the text in a way to use those tools to analyze it than say trying to put it in conversation with philosophical grammar. 9. There's a whole literature on the linguistic and conceptual traffic between the New Testament and Hellenistic thought. The classic example, of course, is the use of logos in John 1. Well, it had in its most immediate backdrop is certainly the Old Testament and the Septuagint and such. There are things that John says about the logos relative to creation that do nevertheless ping something like, comparatively, the role that the logos plays in some versions of Greek philosophical thought. And the point is not that John is borrowing directly or that the concepts are precisely the same, but they are overlapping and comparable both positively and negatively. Simply pointing out conceptual differences does nothing to demonstrate no similarities. For instance, the mediating role of the logos relative to everything else in the created order. An overly ideological and tribal analysis, simply angling for Hebrew uniqueness, will distort more than illuminate. For the apparatus on this question, see the recent discussion of the logos in John Bett's Christ, the Logos of Creation, and Michael Bird's recent Jesus Among the Gods has a fairly extensive discussion of all the kind of background to the use of logos as well. 10, and finally, most importantly, this doesn't mean there is nothing unique in the Christian synthesis, but it can be discovered rather than imposed. We miss something if we fail to engage the New Testament, and the early Christians is already beginning the conversation for us and pointing to realities, sometimes in deliberately philosophical language, that when formally interrogated, take philosophy on a journey it would never have taken otherwise. The aforementioned work of Zach Huber, and likewise Jordan Daniel Wood's recent work on Maximus, Creation is Incarnation, I think it's called, are important texts in this regard. But perhaps most basic, arguably it is in light of the Christian synthesis that we are able to give a full account of the meaning of the very particularity in history and concreteness that the biblical theologians are concerned to give pride of place to in our grasp of reality. The philosophy of the Christian church does not treat the concrete particularity of God's acts in history as our catalysts to get to the real and more universal things. Indeed, in one sense, the universal things are the scaffolding of God's concrete universal saying of all things in the face of Christ in space and time history. Or as von Balthasar was fond of saying, in Christ we have the concrete analogia entis, the concrete analogy of being. Or if it is an augriism you'd prefer, but mark this small one, that the two ends meet. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Sir Riggins.
That was great, Joe. Thank you for such a wonderful lecture. Um, Go ahead and take a brief, about 3 minute break, just to give people some time to think of some questions. So by now, I think everybody has a good grasp of how Zoom works, but there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit questions that way, and I will present them to Joe as they come in. So we'll take about 3 minutes, give Joe a chance to catch his breath, and give people time to think of some questions. Okay, so somebody wants to know, if Lewis was alive today, what is your sense, based on the glimpses we have of his vision of the history of Revelation, what he would stress as to what we most need to attend to in the practice of Christian faith?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One is I'm going to give two answers, and I'm really just kind of pulling from everything I've read in Lewis, and I'm trying to make it very, very, very practical. He does think that in the modern world, one of the things that is radically altered is our attention. When I tried to use the word attention a bunch in the lecture, because it's what you attend to by habit and mental instinct and all those sorts of things that radically reshapes your experience, and does so for humans throughout time. And we have a very different way of attending to time and to the things around us and to ourselves. And Lewis thinks throughout his writing, there are two things I think I see fairly frequently. One is it's very, very spiritually important for people to enjoy. That sounds kind of weird, but to attend to things in such a way that you genuinely enjoy, what he might call the simple pleasures. One of the ways to be oriented, I think, in his judgment, this is in Screwtape Letters. There's a fascinating instance where the Christian that is being tempted by the demon comes out of a longer stage of temptation because he reads a book that he wants to read, not because anybody told him to read it, and goes for a walk that he wanted to go to, not because anybody told him to go for it. And that it was actually being brought back, nevertheless, to that slowed down pressedness into creation through one's values and desires, in a sense, that reorients the person relative to reality and makes them see how fake on the margins their life is. And I think Lewis, you might think we're all hedonists and we just indulge ourselves, and we do in a way, but Lewis also thinks a lot of that is playing a game, and that we actually don't attend to genuine human pleasures. And another thing I think he thinks we need to attend to very deeply is the neighbor. That famous quote in The Weight of Glory about, maybe I'm misremembering, I think it is The Weight of Glory, that famous quote where he effectively says, your neighbor is the most sacred thing apart from the sacrament in your experience. And the reason I think that's actually so crucial, because the question came from in the modern world, that was effectively how it was asked, in the modern world, and right now, what should we focus on? I think Lewis really thinks that we're losing the ability to genuinely encounter others in some way. And the reason that's very, very important is because it would be very easy to think that what Lewis wants is for us to kind of do all these retrieval projects, or go back to when things weren't this way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he kind of implies a life where you're plugged into the world that you're already in, and you encounter a neighbor, maybe even a neighbor that's like doesn't think like you or is very different or whatever, but that you find that encounter very, very sacred. He wants you, when you bump into people, to find them very, very sacred and to attend to them reverently in the soul, as though that's what's happening when you encounter a human. And so that I think is a big part of it. In Miracles, in his chapter, I think it's called Answers to Misgivings, chapter 6, he likewise has a really good discussion of uh, kind of what might God be doing in the modern order given all this chaos? And effectively, he argues that it might be that God is trying to give wisdom that was formerly kind of kept among the sages to be more mass distributed among normies. And in a sense, you can see that that's what Lewis is doing in his whole corpus. What is he doing but taking the medieval, the ancient, the biblical, the philosophical, the moral tradition, pulling it all together in one big pool and then turning it into a novel and readable prose for modern self-educators. He's ultimately he's a layman of the Church of England, self-described, but he's nevertheless writing to lay people in a way I think that is trying to fulfill that sense of what moment we're in, which is this age of mass hysteria and idiocy, but might in God's redemption be a moment of more mass internalized wisdom.
That's very helpful, and that ties in nicely with this next question about language. Um, Somebody writes, "I'm feeling a call to intellectual humility, especially in reading across eras, including the Testament, and honoring different forms of language. And yet, a preacher must preach. What language should he use? Material, spiritual, or some mixture of both?"
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in one sense we always use our own language. Like it's helpful to go back and try to imagine why would this person have said it that way, and then go forward and say why would this person have said it that way and whatever. But we're always starting with ourselves, and I think you might be adjusting on the margins for pedagogical purposes. The way we say things gets a mind to gesture a certain way, gets a soul or a will to gesture a certain way, and that's just how rhetoric works. But good rhetoric is also starting with the audience in front of you, which is how do we talk? Excuse me. And you might be correcting that a bit, but I don't think there should be a great deal of felt pressure to kind of, you know, undo, the structure of our own grammar or something like that, and then get back into kind of the most ancient way of saying things, except that we can become, maybe one thing we could say is that we can become more ourselves, or we can become wiser selves in speaking in a modern way. And so Lewis is certainly interested in the way that we can use contemporary speech to kind of evade reality rather than grab a hold of reality. And so, for instance, a huge part of that hideous strength, right, is this massive pouring out of kind of all this bureaucratic speak you find in the mouth of Wither, the sort of CEO of the Nice, right? And he's never really saying anything, and he's never really giving advice, and he uses an enormous amount of words to basically ring up a big fat zero in terms of actual content. And so Lewis is critical of all sorts of the ways we deploy language, but I don't think he's after us, apart from, of course, it's great to know Latin and Greek and all these things, and Lewis loves philology and all that sort of thing. But I don't think he thinks that we're impoverished in some profound, irreplaceable way if we speak like a modern person. And part of this is because the ancient stuff, in both the view of Barfield and Lewis and Bavon and all these folks, is preserved in contemporary language. So we don't want to think of it as though language has completely lost these kinds of ancient unities. There's probably lots of things we say that if we stare at them long enough and we sort of say like, oh, it's interesting that humans put it that way, that are just preserved in ourselves, are preserved in our language in such a way that what we're calling modern language in a sense is an addition. And so it's kind of latent within our own speech to some extent. It's latent within our own speech that we can speak more potently and more with a grasp to reality. But largely I'd say like I don't think it's anything to get overly nervous about, except in as much as we want to grasp a hold of reality in some potent way within ourselves and to our audience.
What To what degree then do you think Lewis has an understanding of like degree is God providentially ordering the development of language?
Hmm.
Does Lewis have a sense of that at all?
I think certainly yes. I'm trying to think of a specific quote. All throughout the literature I'm quoting or the novels I'm quoting, there is there are constant references to divine providence and what God is doing, and there's a kind of way in which God is uh, setting humans upon a journey. Like Lewis really is looking at the human race as a history of pedagogy in a way, and it's not only a history of pedagogy. It's not only a history of growth and knowledge. It's there's more ways to look at history than that, but it's not less than that kind of thing. And original language is kind of set upon that journey in a sense. Um, it's providentially ordered in some sense in that reality is dense and we want to say as much of it as we can. And language has a capacity in its interior origins to grow. And so and then does God come in and kind of providentially order it? Certainly, divine revelation probably is partly that. And in some sense, it might be useful then to, compare the way ancient Hebrew texts write about various things versus the surrounding cultures write about various things. Are the things going on the way God is gesturing? But in fact, we don't even need to put that in a question. It's clear that there are things going on in the way God is self-revealing and speaking and relating to all these terms in a way that's correcting the way that they might otherwise speak on some register. So I think certainly it's got to be the case that Lewis is going to have God providentially supervening in a sense through both historical covenantal acts, or he enters into space and time, or through the sages, or ultimately through Christ. But also nevertheless within that there's a lot left to human craft, because language is also part of dominion. It's Adam that has to go name the animals, right?
Hmm. To what degree then do you think this influences or should influence things like liturgical language and the way in which we speak back to God?
Well, this is where I mean, certainly, again, part of this is sort of to say, just like the words we learned when we were kids, we never stopped using them. Uh, the Some of the ways we imagined and related to God as very small children are still the way we imagine and relate to God, and that's right. We've added to that, not taken away from it. And so, in a sense, when we talk about liturgical language, I think I just want to say you're drawing from the whole. Mostly, of course, in liturgy, you're drawing from scripture because that's divine speech in a way that other speech is not divine speech. You're drawing largely from the scriptures. And of course, you can add things that we say the way that we say them, albeit rooted in the gestures and in the way scripture has set us upon to think. And so, yeah. I don't know if that's a good enough answer. In one sense, I just think for liturgy, you're drawing upon the whole history of the way we've talked about God, because none of that history is not present to us. It really still means something to us to hear God as our rock. Like that actually does still minister to the soul in a way that saying God is reliable does not minister to the soul.
Um, Someone else asks, what do you think would be Lewis's assessment of Taylor's age?
You broke out there for a second. Lewis's assessment of what?
Of Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. How do you think he would understand that?
Oh,
He would see.
that's a really good question. There are parallels. So, as I said, like Taylor's movement from the kind of porous self to the buffered self. Lewis really will speak about that as modernity. I think he'd place some of that a bit later. The real ascendancy of naturalism for Lewis is maybe a bit later, though he sees the mental habits that are going to become modernity already in the early modern period, I think. Um, and so there's definitely something complementary going on there. I'm trying to think of what would be a point of contrast. Lewis is obviously a much more self-consciously kind of evangelical. Maybe is a word that can mean different things. So maybe that's not the word I want to use in this particular context. But Lewis is certainly an Orthodox Christian. Like he's an Orthodox Christian in the way that he's imagining this story, and he has a lot more interest in what the devil is doing in our lives, and its end, why this stage and what's it going to lead to. Whereas Taylor really is coming at it something like a philosophical sociologist. He is interested in where this all leads and that sort of thing, but I'd say that the normative questions are not as they're not as present or foreground. Taylor's job is much more descriptive than normative. There's nothing normative in Taylor. There's something more normative in Lewis, and I think Lewis is also. Yeah, no, I won't say more than that. I don't want to. I don't want to overstate what the contrast would be. I do think my mind is gesturing at a contrast, but it's there are more subterranean philosophical motivations. Maybe that's a way to put it. I do think there are philosophical motivations from which they come to see these somewhat similar developments, somewhat described the same way. And those philosophies then would perhaps cash out in very different ways. But the thing that is similar about them is that progressive move toward more and more distantiation from things that you see from the early modern to the modern periods. And that through, for Lewis especially, that through habituated attention. It is largely because of a certain received and developed habit of attention that those experiences of the world change.
This is all great stuff. Um, well, it looks like we've exhausted all of our audience questions. So I want to throw it back to you. What's next? Tell us about upcoming writing projects. And this is a Davenant Hall Fellows Lecture. So tell us about some upcoming courses that you're going to be.
Yeah, my next course, I'll be going back to teaching philosophy for theology. I haven't taught that, I think, except I think it's been about a year. I've taught that course the most, and I'm finally teaching it again. That's coming up this spring, and then I think we'll have a philosophy as a way of life course coming up as well. Actually, I think the way we nominate them, it'll technically be our winter semester. That I'll be teaching philosophy for theology, because we do that in January and February. And then spring, I believe, is philosophy as a way of life. Those are really fun. Philosophy for theology is a kind of survey of, if you want the 100,000 foot up perspective on kind of classical metaphysics, epistemology, philosophical anthropology, ethics, kind of all the moving parts of classical philosophical grammar. And you just want to kind of see them all, the moving parts together in a kind of encyclopedia fashion, as it were, which then is kind of wets the whistle, gets your mind moving in that philosophical manner with all the terms, so that you can go into a class like my good brother Ryan Hurd's, where he gets way more into the weeds. But your mind has been made a little more limber, as it were, before you go into that more heavy lifting. So I'll be teaching that. Writing projects, I have an essay on, Davenant is publishing this really fun series of essays on Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. And I have an essay on That Hideous Strength and the Nice, this interesting institution, and the culture wars. What is Lewis saying about contemporary culture wars? Or what is relevant to contemporary culture wars in Lewis's That Hideous Strength relative to the Nice? And then I'm working on a book that's sort of I think maybe the last book I hope to work on for a while, but it's a book that's basically a kind of philosophical guided tour and introduction to Christianity for late modern people. So most of my work so far that's been published is focused on the question of God and his existence alone, working through tensions that people might have relative to God's existence. This newer book, which I hope will only be about 300 pages or so, is an attempt to walk through the whole Christian faith and kind of be the tour guide for a modern mind that's like, none of this makes sense. It's just kind of weird. How can anybody think that? And it's not so much like I'm going to prove every single one of these things to you, but I want to walk along and say, think of it this way, and think of that this way, and think of that this way, and then give enough kind of guided bibliography and such that somebody with a curious mind who wants to really explore whether Christianity really does illuminate reality and is plausible on a human register relative to what human minds and wills and life are really like, and relative to what we can know through other sources. It's basically hopefully a kind of tour guide, if you will, of those sorts of things. And so that's hopefully a book I'll have written within the next year.
Those all sound great. Would you say a little bit about the philosophy as a way of life class? Because I think that's super cool, and I want people to hear about it.
Yeah, philosophy as a way of life is I mean, in a sense, what we're doing there is that philosophy in the modern period and the modern world, like all disciplines, has undergone that kind of trajectory of specialization that happens in all these discourses. And there's some things that come out of that are good and interesting, but it can lose the kind of flavor and the final end of what philosophy was in its origin and really for a good portion of its history, which is to say, philosophy kind of becomes a kind of an abstract grammar where I'm starting from the clouds, not in reality. I'm kind of starting in the clouds and I'm just going through kind of formal mental motions and logic chopping through things, generating and solving problems as it were in my head. And that's not all of modern philosophy. I don't want to project on. There's plenty of exceptions to that sort of thing. But philosophy largely becomes formalized and abstracted and then going on in my head by itself, if you will. Philosophy as a way of life really is trying to capture that originally philosophy really wasn't this kind of abstracted mental thing going on in my closet. It was rather a discourse that had to do with the whole of life. You might say that philosophy, as it was originally conceived, was an attempt to grasp the unity of things in the unity of things as formally as I could grasp them in the mind, but for the illumination of my whole life. And then part of the project is the conformity of my whole life, the conformity of the unification of myself, you might say, with the unity of all things that I am discovering in the mind, in the formal order. And what you see then is throughout the history of philosophy is different ways of doing that. So philosophies are always tied to schools. It's kind of like, what we think of as philosophy proper, reading books and going through these arguments was just kind of one part of the practice of the philosophical dojo, you might say, which is full of practices of the mind, practices of the body, and that sort of thing that put together your whole life and the stuff you're actually studying and writing about. And so what we're doing there is looking at philosophy as a way of life as it was originally thought, as it changed in the late antique period, but then as it's transformed by Christianity. So it's fascinating that Jesus is considered by the earliest followers and read by many Greco-Roman commentators as a philosopher. The Hebrews as a nation of philosophers, and the Jews and the Christians as philosophical in their own way. And one of the things that's interesting, in fact, that you find there is that whereas philosophy in most of these schools was very much an elite thing, it was very much a sort of thing that was only attainable mentally and otherwise through good birth, through long habit formation, through all these sorts of things. And the end was maybe through all of this, I can become unafraid of death and get rid of anxiety or something like that. And then you get Christianity comes along with somebody that looks in that taxonomy something quite like a philosopher, as Jonathan Pennington has recently argued. But then somehow after Jesus, you get kind of normies. You get Joe the plumber who's suddenly unafraid of death and isn't very anxious anymore. And that's very interesting. It's like like the end of philosophy has been brought to bear through the resurrection of Christ and the normal consciousness. And that does things to philosophy throughout. And so what we're really doing is looking at the history of philosophy a little bit from a philosophy as a way of life angle, and then looking at Jesus and Paul as kind of like philosophers in their own right within that history. And then, of course, the goal is to illuminate our own practice and our own definition and practice of philosophy in our own context.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Somebody wants to know if you'd repeat that title of the book that you just mentioned.
Which one?
The philosophy and Jesus one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Jonathan Pennington, Jesus, the Great Philosopher. That's very helpful, and you can find more argumentation along those lines in Pennington's Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. He also makes a similar argument in that book as well.
check that out. I didn't know about that one. Thank you. This has all been great. So I hope that people show up for those two classes because they sound like they're going to be a lot of fun. Thank you so much for this lecture, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you for these gracious answers to these good questions.